From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Thursday, January 30th. 14 members of a fringe Christian group were found guilty of the manslaughter of diabetic girl Elizabeth Strews on Wednesday. The 8-year-old died after the group, who call themselves the Saints and shun medical treatment, withheld her insulin for several days. Hopes of a pre-election rate cut are high after inflation fell to its lowest level in 4 years in December. The drop came as a surprise to economists who say the Reserve Bank could offer mortgage holders some long-awaited relief when it meets next month. Those stories are live right now at theaustralian.com.au. A federal election is just around the corner, and that means the major parties are rattling the tin for campaign donations. But it's a lavish dinner attended by the Prime Minister that's piqued our Victorian editor's attention. That's today's episode. In November, a group of people sat down for a meal in one of Melbourne's ritziest neighbourhoods. The table had been laid with a white tablecloth and gleaming silverware. Wine glasses containing a rich red drop clinked, and the Indian-inspired food even came topped with gold leaf. As conversation bounced back and forth, someone cracked a joke.
The wife's just organising this.
Former Victorian Premier Dan Andrews, who was seated to the right of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, picked up the thread.
The logic there is that instead of being processed together, they're being processed separately. Exactly.
Around the table were members of Melbourne's Indian Australian business community, and it appears from the audio you've just heard that they've got some feedback for the Prime Minister.
It's not often that you get to see how Victorian ALP politics is made here.
Damon Johnston is The Australian's Victorian editor.
But this video, albeit short, shows you Dan controlling the discussion when issues around visas are raised. So, these are very significant issues, and I think the Australian public deserves to know exactly what was discussed, how much money was donated to buy a seat at this table, if in fact any was, and how many more of these sort of events are being held.
And Damon, what have you determined to be the purpose of this lunch?
The Prime Minister's office won't confirm that it was a political fundraising event designed to extract donations from those who attended to help bankroll the 2025 federal election. We put that specific question to the PMO and they just refused to engage on it. Now, I've got multiple people within the Victorian ALP who believe that the only way that you can get the Prime Minister and a former Labor Premier to your private house, even when it is a Toorak mansion, is to have it as a fundraising event. However, we don't know that to be 100% the case, but certainly many within the party are making that speculation.
The dinner was hosted at a Toorak mansion belonging to Dushyant Khanna and his wife Redeema. One of the dozen or so attendees described it in a post on Instagram as 4 hours of exquisite cuisine and hospitality. Another said it was an incredible moment and milestone for the Indian business leaders who came forward to support it, as well as the widespread community they represent. The Prime Minister's private secretary, David Epstein, was also in attendance. But it's the man who was seated on the other side of Anthony Albanese that piqued Damon's interest.
Okay, so Rupinder Brar is a very successful, industrious Indian-Australian businessman. He's worth many, many millions, tens of millions, according to some people I've spoken to. He's been very successful in the construction industry, both commercial and residential. However, there's another arm of his business, the international student business, that has struck some problems, and this is why the story becomes interesting. Now, in May last year, the federal regulator of international colleges, so this is the watchdog that essentially checks for compliance on companies that bring in foreign students. They deregistered Rupinder Bhar's company called Barclay International College. And they did this because they determined that there was significant non-compliance. And in a statement to The Australian for this story, they've confirmed that non-compliance was around governance, enrolments, marketing. So these are really key pillars of the international college business. Currently, Barclay has appealed that decision and is going through the hearing process and will be determined later this year. They got an interim stay on the deregistration, but there are some limitations on what it can continue to do. I don't think it can enrol any new students, and there are ongoing restrictions. Now, Barclay are still operating at a level, and they are hopeful that they will overturn this. But it becomes interesting because ASQA, they've launched almost 200 fresh investigations. So in the midst of this crackdown, here we have a private dinner in a Toorak mansion where you have an operator of a deregistered international student company sitting next to the Prime Minister.
Based on social media posts made by the attendees, visas, tourism, the economy and the property and construction sectors were discussed. At the time, student visas in particular were a hot topic. With record migration putting pressure on housing, services and infrastructure, the government was looking for solutions to keep international student numbers in check. Having failed to introduce caps through legislation, the government pursued a different route.
Under the new direction, when universities reach 80% of their government-set quota, which is different for each institution, the pace of visa approvals will slow.
Plus, the Australian Skills Quality Authority was also cracking down on international student operators following a multi-million-dollar funding boost. We heard in that video, and as you've just said, that visas in various capacities were discussed apparently at this event. We don't really, as members of the public, hear much of this kind of political wheeling and dealing here in Australia, as much as we might do in an American context, for example. But do you think there is any significance to the fact that the government's visa programs were apparently discussed at this event, where at least one attendee, being Rupinder Bhar, clearly has a vested interest in the continued flow of international students, particularly from India, into the country?
Well, we asked the Prime Minister's office, did they discuss international students in any capacity? What else did they talk about? And the PMO wouldn't confirm or deny what they discussed. As for Mr. Bhar, he has not returned calls. I believe he is overseas travelling. There's a lot of people not wanting to talk about this story. I've also sent questions to Daniel Andrews. He has not responded. And the businessman who hosted the event at his Toorak mansion, he and his wife are also travelling overseas. They've not responded in any detailed way, other than the wife did tell me this morning over the phone that it was a memorable event.
Coming up, a window into the post-premiership life of Dan Andrews. Dan Andrews has kept a relatively low profile since he pulled the pin on his long and storied politics career in late 2023.
All of that work, I am worse than a workaholic. I'd spend every waking moment is about the work, and there's only so long you can do that for. You never want to finish up in a situation where you aren't enjoying the work and where you are resentful of the fact that you're doing this and not doing something else. I'm not at that point.
His appearance at a lavish dinner alongside Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, as told through social media posts made by those in attendance, provides unique insight into what he's been up to since then. Here's Damon Johnston.
We don't know a lot about Dan Andrews' role in this Toorak function. What we do know, courtesy of the video and the photos, was that he was there. Did he organise the event? We don't know. I asked him that question in an email. I didn't get a response. I asked the PMO that question and I didn't get a response. Has he organised any other similar fundraising events? we don't know the answer to those questions. We do know that he remains very well connected within the Indian Australian community from his time as Premier. And we also know that he's close to Albanese. So I guess the listeners can make up their own mind.
Just lastly, Damon, there was a time when it felt like Dan Andrews was all over TV and radio, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. What does his appearance tell us about how he's spending his professional time after politics?
So you're right, Dan has sunk from public view largely. He had possibly one of the highest profiles of a state leader in the history of Federation, courtesy of the COVID lockdowns here. Since his resignation, he's done very little public media. However, he's very busy behind the scenes. He's established his own private business empire, of which he's the director. He's partnered with a former member of staff, and we know that he's got connections in China. But what this shows is that Dan Andrews, despite not being on our televisions anymore, remains a figure of influence within Victorian politics, particularly Labor politics.
Damon Johnston is the Australian's Victorian editor. You can read all about the PM's trip to Toorak right now at theaustralian.com.au.